Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Alien professor challenged students to hack Unbreakable system. Human bypasses it without line of code. Professor exits lecture hall was unlike anything Darren Carter had ever seen. The ceiling arched high above, an intricate lattice of shimmering lights that pulsed in sync with the professor's voice. The walls shifted subtly, displaying constantly updating lines of code, security protocols, and holographic projections of firewalls so advanced that even the most skilled hackers in the galaxy would have struggled to breach them. The air buzzed with an artificial hum, the sound of quantum processors running millions of simulations per second. Darren adjusted his seat, leaning back slightly as his eyes flicked over the alien students surrounding him. There were at least 24 competitors, each from a species renowned for their intelligence. The Drayan sitting to his left was massive, his reptilian fingers tapping against a holographic keyboard at a speed no human could match. His scales shimmered under the neon blue glow of his console as he muttered complex encryption algorithms under his breath. A Zellan sat across from Darren, his metallic eyes scanning rapidly through thousands of lines of code, analyzing system weaknesses in ways that only synthetic minds could. The insectoid Vorin, whose kind were infamous for their ability to process information in parallel thought streams, had already deployed a network of cyber drones that hovered around his console, each running separate penetration tests. Professor Exal, a towering being with translucent skin that revealed the faint glow of his internal circulatory system, stepped forward. His voice resonated through the chamber, more felt than heard. "Today's challenge," he said, "is one that has never been overcome. Before you is the Galactic Security Core, the most advanced firewall in existence. It adapts, it learns, and it does not break. Your goal, infiltrate its mainframe and gain access to the secure data cache." A collective murmur spread through the room. The Galactic Security Core was infamous, a creation of the most advanced cybernetic minds in the universe. Its quantum encryption keys changed every nanosecond, its firewall defenses were capable of self-repair, and its AI countermeasures could detect and neutralize even the most sophisticated cyber attacks before they could take effect. Every previous attempt to breach it had failed. Darren glanced at his console, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the interface. Unlike the others, he hadn't even powered it on. He wasn't in a rush. Professor Exal's gaze swept across the room. "You have 24 hours. Succeed, and you will have proven yourselves worthy of the highest honors in the field of cyber warfare. Fail, and you will have learned why this system remains unbreakable." A countdown appeared on the displays, 24:00:00. The challenge had begun. Immediately, the room erupted into action. The Drayan beside Darren hissed as he activated his hacking scripts, his console flashing with cascading lines of code. The Zellan across from him launched a sophisticated brute force attack, cycling through millions of potential key combinations per second. The Vorin cyber drones synchronized, each one attempting a different intrusion method, probing the system from multiple angles at once. Darren watched in silence. He had no doubt that these students were brilliant, their techniques refined through years of study and experience. But he also knew something they didn't. Most hackers, no matter how skilled, saw security systems as walls to be broken down. They focused on attacking encryption, bypassing firewalls, and exploiting vulnerabilities in code. But security was more than just software. Security was about people. Darren finally activated his console, but instead of launching any kind of intrusion attempt, he simply observed. His eyes followed the security log scrolling across the display, noting every failed attempt by the other students. The system was designed to defend against attacks it expected: brute force, sophisticated algorithms, and AI-driven exploits. But what if someone approached it from a completely different angle? He tapped his fingers lightly against the interface, his mind working through the problem. Every security system, no matter how advanced, had one common weakness: human oversight. Someone had designed this firewall, someone had built its defenses, written its code, and implemented its countermeasures. And that someone, despite their genius, was still only a person. Darren pulled up the system's external access points. Most were locked down, heavily encrypted and monitored by the AI. But there, buried under layers of redundant security features, was something simple, a password reset option. He smirked. It was a common oversight. Most high-security systems focused so much on external threats that they neglected the simpler, more human vulnerabilities. He clicked on the reset link. A prompt appeared. Enter administrator email for password recovery. Darren leaned back, considering. Finding the right email could have been difficult, except that government directories often listed personnel publicly. A quick search pulled up a list of registered administrators for the Galactic Security Corp. He cross-referenced their names with common email structures used in interstellar bureaucracies. Within minutes, he had a highly probable address. He entered it. Password reset email sent, the screen flickered. A moment later, his secondary interface received an incoming message, a system-generated reset link waiting for him to use it. Darren's smirk widened. He didn't need to hack the firewall. He didn't need to break its encryption or bypass its AI defenses. He had just walked in through the front door. The alien students around him remained oblivious, their focus locked on their increasingly desperate hacking attempts. The Drayan had begun rerouting additional processing power to his attack scripts. The Zelen was running out of new quantum keys to test, and the Vor's drones were starting to overheat. The professor, watching from the front of the room, monitored their progress with an expression of detached curiosity. Darren entered the temporary credentials from the reset email. The system processed his request, and an instant later he was in. A loud, piercing alarm sounded across the chamber. The security system flashed red, signaling a breach. The professor's translucent skin darkened, his gaze snapping toward Darren. The other students froze, their attempts forgotten as they turned toward him in shock. The screen before him displayed a single message: access granted. Silence fell over the room. Professor Exal took a slow step forward. His voice, usually calm and measured, held an edge of disbelief. "Explain," he commanded. Darren leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms casually. "I didn't hack the system," he said, his tone almost amused. "I just asked it to let me in." The professor stared at him for a long moment, then let out a deep, resonant laugh that echoed through the chamber. "Clever, very clever." The Drayan slammed a scaled fist against his console, his frustration barely contained. The Zelen's synthetic eyes narrowed in what could only be described as irritation. The Voron's antenna twitched erratically. None of them had even considered such an approach. Professor Exal nodded approvingly. "A lesson for all of you," he said, addressing the room. "Cybersecurity is not just about breaking encryption. It is about understanding how systems and the people who build them operate. The greatest weaknesses are often not found in code, but in oversight." He turned back to Darren, his expression thoughtful. "You have passed the test." Darren gave a small shrug. It wasn't much of a challenge. The professor chuckled again. "Perhaps not for you, but I suspect the rest of the galaxy has much to learn from your unconventional methods." Darren stood, his console shutting down with a flick of his wrist. As he walked toward the exit, he could feel the stares of the other students, a mix of frustration, admiration, and disbelief. He didn't mind. After all, a true hacker didn't just break systems, he outthought them. The moment the security breach alert sounded, chaos erupted in the room. Every student's interface flashed red, their connection to the hacking challenge severed instantly. The Drayan let out a sharp hiss, his scaled fingers tightening into fists as his screen turned blank. The Zelen's synthetic pupils flickered in rapid succession, scanning his inactive console as if trying to process what had just happened. The Voron's cyber drones, still hovering around his station, emitted a synchronized pulse of frustration before retreating into their designated docking ports. None of them had expected failure, and yet in an instant, the entire challenge had ended because of a human. Darren remained in his seat, calm as ever, while the professor strode toward him. Exal's translucent skin pulsed with shifting hues, an indicator of deep contemplation. He wasn't angry, that much was clear. If anything, he seemed intrigued. The alien's elongated fingers hovered just above Darren's console, his expression unreadable. "You did not break the system," Exal finally said, his voice resonating through the room. You simply bypassed it. Darren nodded. That's what security is, isn't it? Finding the easiest way in. A ripple of murmurs spread through the remaining students. Some of them stared in disbelief, others in grudging admiration. The Drayan looked particularly agitated, his sharp teeth bared in frustration. This was supposed to be a test of skill, he growled, not trickery. Darren turned his head slightly, meeting the reptilian glare with a relaxed smile. If the test was about getting in, then I got in. Maybe the real trick is thinking differently. Professor Exal let out a low hum, the kind that signaled deep thought. It would seem that your approach was unconventional. His glowing eyes shifted to the other students. And yet I do not recall specifying how you were to complete the task. The objective was to gain access. He did. The Vorin, his compound eyes glimmering, twitched one of his many limbs in frustration. It feels like cheating. Darren shrugged. If it was, then the system wouldn't have let me do it. Exal tapped a long finger against his console, considering. Then, with a deliberate motion, he turned to address the entire room. Cybersecurity is not only about superior technology, he said. It is about understanding the minds of those who create and operate it. No matter how advanced a system is, its greatest weakness will always be its designer. Today, you have all learned a valuable lesson. The room fell silent. No one could argue with that. No one dared. Then, without warning, the professor's interface lit up again. The red alert on the walls faded, replaced by something new, an incoming transmission from an external channel. Darren leaned forward slightly, catching the encrypted signal signature flashing on the screen. The other students, still standing in tense silence, now turned their focus to the professor. Even the Drayan seemed to forget his frustration as Exal narrowed his eyes at the unfamiliar code appearing before him. Unexpected, Exal murmured. His fingers moved through the air, manipulating the projection, running instant diagnostics. His usual composed demeanor flickered with the barest hint of unease. Darren, always curious, tilted his head as he examined the unfamiliar symbols. The code structure didn't match anything from the Security Corps' defenses. It wasn't part of the challenge. It wasn't even something local. It was an outside force. Professor, the Zealon finally spoke, his voice a smooth, metallic whisper. That's not one of ours, is it? Exal didn't answer immediately. Instead, he expanded the projection, making the data visible to all. The alien student stepped closer, analyzing the incoming signal with suspicion. No, Exal admitted, it is not. A cold sensation ran through the room. For all their differences, every student present understood what that meant. The Galactic Security Corps was considered unbreakable, but something, was trying to breach it in real time. Darren's fingers tapped lightly against his console. That's an attack, he said, voicing what everyone already knew. A real one. The professor's translucent skin darkened slightly. It would seem so. The Drayan let out a low growl from where he stood. Exal's fingers moved rapidly, processing the incoming transmission. The code pulsed with strange irregularities, shifting unpredictably as if adapting on the fly. The usual AI countermeasures weren't responding. Firewalls were holding, but barely. Source unknown, the professor admitted, but this is no simple intrusion. It is rewriting itself as it moves. Darren's brows lifted. That was rare. Most cyber attacks followed some kind of pattern, a recognizable sequence of logic. But this, it was reacting in real time, morphing between algorithms like a living entity. Zellen's artificial pupils dilated. That is impossible. No standard AI functions in such an organic way. Darren's mind worked fast. Something about this attack felt off. It wasn't just aggressive. It wasn't just efficient. It felt intentional. It felt like it was watching. Then, as if in response to his thoughts, the data stream shifted again. The alien symbols realigned, reorganizing themselves into something new, something readable. A message. Darren barely had time to process it before the translation module kicked in and the words appeared on screen. You are not ready. The room froze. No one spoke. No one moved. Every student, every console, every pulsing light in the chamber seemed to pause as the weight of the message settled over them. Darren's heart beat a little faster. He had seen many things in his career, but this wasn't a mere hacking attempt. This was a warning, and whoever or whatever was sending it had just proven that the Galactic Security Corps was not as impenetrable as everyone believed. Professor Exal's gaze lingered on the words for a long moment before he finally spoke. His voice, usually so steady, carried the faintest edge of concern. "This lesson," he said, "has just become far more important than any of us anticipated." Darren exhaled slowly. Something was coming, and it knew they weren't ready. Professor Exal's fingers hovered over the interface as the message remained fixed on the screen, pulsing softly as if waiting. The room had fallen into complete silence, an unnatural stillness settling over the gathered students. Darren could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. No one was ready to move, to speak, to react. Even the Drayan, who had been the loudest voice of frustration minutes ago, remained frozen, his reptilian eyes locked onto the display. Then the words flickered just once. A subtle distortion, barely noticeable but enough to send a chill down Darren's spine. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers twitching over his console, resisting the instinct to type something, anything, in response. His gut told him that whatever was on the other end of this message was still watching. Zelen, who had been analyzing the transmission since the moment it appeared, finally moved. His synthetic pupils constricted as he tilted his head in the slightest motion of unease. "This is not standard intrusion behavior," he murmured. "It is not testing defenses. It is not breaking encryption. It is communicating." Exal nodded slowly, his translucent skin shifting through a range of colors that Darren didn't yet know how to interpret. "Which means it is aware of us." The Vorin, who had been silent since the breach, twitched his antenna as he accessed his own terminal, running rapid decryption attempts on the transmission. "We need to determine the origin. This could be an advanced AI experiment, a classified military project." He stopped abruptly, his compound eyes widening slightly. "Or something worse." Darren exhaled slowly. "You mean something alive?" No one answered him immediately, but the silence itself was answer enough. The message flickered again. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the text on the screen shifted, rewriting itself in a language Darren didn't recognize. Exal's interface responded instantly, translating it back into Galactic Standard. "Observation complete. Conclusion, insufficient readiness, terminating connection." Darren's hands clenched slightly as he sat up straighter. Terminating connection, that meant it was leaving. Exal's hands moved in a blur, sending counter commands through the interface in an attempt to hold on to the data stream. "No," he said sharply, the first real sign of tension in his voice. "Not yet." But it was already happening. The alien symbols began dissolving, fragmenting into static as the transmission began to collapse. Zelen's fingers darted across his own console. "I am logging all residual data patterns before the signal fades." The Vorin was doing the same, his limbs moving with practiced efficiency, attempting to extract any remaining trace signatures. Darren wasn't sure what he could do, but his instincts screamed at him to act. His eyes darted across his console, searching for something, anything that might hold on to the connection just a little longer. Then he saw it, a handshake protocol buried beneath the failing signal. There was still an active process attempting to verify the integrity of the transmission. A security feature, or maybe just a built-in redundancy. Either way, it was still open. He didn't hesitate. His fingers flew across the interface, sending a simple reply before the connection could sever entirely. For a moment, nothing happened. The transmission continued to disintegrate, breaking apart in real time. Then, just as it was about to vanish completely, the entire system froze. The flickering text stabilized, the static halted, the transmission stopped collapsing. Darren barely had time to process what had just happened before the message changed again. "Response received. Awaiting input." A stunned silence filled the room. Every student, every professor, every piece of advanced technology in the lab seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Exal turned his head slightly, his luminous gaze settling on Darren with something that almost resembled amusement. "Interesting," he murmured. Darren exhaled, then forced himself to focus. He had stopped the signal from vanishing, but now he had an even bigger problem. What the hell was he supposed to say? He could feel every eye in the room on him, waiting. He hadn't expected this to work, hadn't thought more than a second ahead. But now something or someone was waiting for his response. He needed to be careful. Whoever or whatever was on the other side of this message had already proven that it could breach the most advanced security system in the galaxy without effort. It wasn't just a hacker or a rogue AI or some experimental military tech. That was beyond them. He inhaled slowly, then typed out his next message. "Who are you?" A pause, the transmission remained stable, but the message did not change. Then, after several long seconds, new words appeared. "Irrelevant inquiry, denied." Darren frowned. That wasn't a normal response. He wasn't being ignored. He was being restricted, like whoever was on the other end had rules about what could be shared. Exal tilted his head, watching closely. "Try again, approach differently." Darren hesitated, then rephrased. "Why are you watching?" This time the answer came faster. Analysis of anomaly required, verification of data, assessment of progression. That wasn't the answer he had expected. It was too clinical. He glanced at the Zelen, who was already running probability models on a secondary console. "Assessment of progression," Darren echoed aloud. The synthetic student nodded slightly. "It implies an expectation of change, a comparison against previous data. We are being measured." The Voron's antenna twitched, but against what? Before Darren could type anything else, the message updated again. "Deviation detected. Status, incomplete development, readiness below threshold. Observation terminated." The words began to distort once more, breaking apart at the edges. Exal's fingers moved swiftly. "Hold it." Darren acted instinctively, trying to send another query, any query to keep the connection open. But it was too late. The transmission vanished. Every console in the room went dark for exactly 3 seconds. Then one by one the displays powered back on. The system had reset. There was no trace of the message, no residual data, no record that it had ever existed. It was just gone. Exal slowly straightened, his expression unreadable. "Well," he finally said, "that was unexpected." The Drayan exhaled sharply, his frustration now replaced with something bordering on unease. What just happened? Zelen's synthetic eyes gleamed as he closed his interface. "We were not hacked," he said. "We were evaluated." Darren sat back, his fingers drumming lightly against the console. He didn't like this. Not at all. Because whoever or whatever was behind that message hadn't just been testing the system. It had been testing them, and according to that final message, they had failed. The silence in the room lingered far longer than it should have. Every console had returned to normal as if nothing had happened. The Galactic Security Core was once again impenetrable. The professor's systems were fully operational. And yet, every student in the room knew the truth. Something had broken in and then disappeared without a trace. Darren's fingers twitched against the console as he stared at the now empty interface. His mind raced through the last few moments of the encounter, trying to piece together what had just happened. It hadn't been a simple breach. It hadn't even been an attack. It had been an evaluation. Someone or something had measured them, determined them unready, and then left without so much as a goodbye. The Drayan, still visibly agitated, let out a sharp breath and turned to Exal. "What do we do now?" His voice, usually steady, carried an edge of uncertainty. It was a rare sight to see a Drayan uneasy. They thrived on challenges, breaking barriers with sheer force. But this was something force couldn't solve. Exal remained motionless for several seconds, his luminous eyes scanning the room as if measuring the weight of the moment. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out and tapped into his personal console. A holographic screen materialized before him, filled with encrypted logs and security reports. His fingers moved fluidly, filtering through layers of classified data. Darren watched carefully. He had seen the professor work before, but this time there was an urgency in his movements. Something about this incident had unsettled him. Zelen finally broke the silence. "Was that an artificial intelligence?" His synthetic pupils adjusted as he analyzed his own recorded data. The transmission lacked traditional algorithmic signatures. No loops, no repeating structures. Every response was unique, reactive. Either someone is using a level of machine learning beyond anything we've encountered, Darren finished, or it was alive. He didn't need to say it loudly. The tension in the room had already led most of them to the same conclusion. The Vorin, usually composed, shifted uneasily. That message, he hesitated, his mandibles twitching slightly. We were measured, it was collecting data, but for what? Exal suddenly stopped. His fingers froze mid-movement, his translucent skin darkening slightly. A reaction Darren had only seen once before, when the professor was processing something deeply concerning. Professor, Darren asked. Exal exhaled, something rare for his species. It was an unnecessary biological reflex, but one he had clearly adopted over years of interaction with humanoid species. Slowly, he turned toward the gathered students. There is something you do not know. The statement alone was enough to send a fresh wave of unease through the room. Exal was not one to withhold knowledge without reason. The Drayan's eyes narrowed. Explain. Exal's fingers moved again, this time bringing up a new data file, one that had been locked away behind several layers of encryption. The holographic display shifted, and for the first time, Darren saw something that made his stomach tighten. A pattern, not just from today's incident, but from many before it. The logs stretched back decades, multiple locations, different security networks. Isolated breaches, always brief, always non-destructive, and always followed by a single message. Observation complete. Conclusion, insufficient readiness. Darren's breath slowed. This has happened before. Exal nodded. Many times, across multiple systems, across multiple civilizations. The Zealon, still reviewing the logs, shook his head. Why hasn't anyone spoken about this? Exal's glowing eyes met his. Because no one remembers. Darren's skin prickled at the implication. What do you mean? The professor's fingers tapped the console again, and the holographic projection shifted, displaying another set of data. This time from memory logs. The files were fragmented, corrupted, no, not corrupted, erased. The Vorin took a step forward, his antenna twitching rapidly. This isn't normal data degradation. No, Exal agreed. It is not. His voice carried something close to reluctance, as if he was revealing something he had long tried to avoid. Every individual, every system that has ever encountered this entity has lost their recollection of it within days. Darren felt the cold weight of realization settle over him. That means we won't remember this, he said, his voice quieter than he intended. Exal inclined his head. Not unless we find a way to stop it. The Drayan let out a low growl, his frustration returning in full force. This thing invades the most secure networks in the galaxy, assesses us like insects, and then wipes the memory of anyone who sees it. He slammed his fist onto his console, his patience finally snapping. What is it waiting for? Exal was silent for a long moment before responding. It is waiting for us to be ready. Darren exhaled sharply. That word again, ready, but ready for what? The Zealon, always wanting to process things methodically, tilted his head. The logical conclusion is that it is monitoring our technological progress. The Vorian nodded. But if it's been doing this for decades, why hasn't it intervened? Darren had a sinking suspicion he already knew the answer. Because we haven't passed its test. Exal confirmed his thought with a slow nod. Every recorded encounter has ended the same way. The entity determines that we are unprepared, and then it ensures that knowledge of its existence does not persist. The Drayan scoffed, and yet you remember. Exal's expression remained neutral, but Darren saw the flicker of something deeper beneath his calm exterior. I remember enough. Darren caught the phrasing immediately, not everything, just enough, and the Zealon was the first to say it aloud. Then it has already erased parts of your memory before. Exal's silence was answer enough. Darren's mind raced. If they were all going to forget, then nothing they did here would matter. But the professor had retained something, even if it wasn't everything. That meant there was a way. There has to be a method of preserving data beyond its reach, Darren said, thinking aloud. Something it can't erase. Exal sighed again, then tapped his console one final time. A single phrase appeared on the holographic screen. Biological memory cannot be altered if it is already lost. Darren's brows furrowed. What does that mean? Exal looked at him, then at the rest of the students. It means, he said, that if we wish to remember, we must forget on our own terms. The room fell silent once more, but this time it was different because now the real test had begun. Darren sat motionless, his mind absorbing the weight of the professor's words. If we wish to remember, we must forget on our own terms. The sentence echoed in his thoughts, looping over and over as he tried to grasp its implication. Around him, the other students remained equally still, some processing in stunned silence, others shifting in unease. The air in the room felt heavier now, the knowledge that their memories would soon be erased looming over them like an unbreakable law of nature. The Drayan was the first to break the silence, his scaled fingers curled into fists, his muscles tense with frustration. You mean to tell me the only way to resist this thing is to erase our own minds before it does? His voice carried an edge of disbelief. That is madness. Exal's gaze remained unwavering. It is not madness, he corrected. It is the only option we have discovered. Darren inhaled deeply, forcing himself to think through the logic. It made sense in a terrifying way. If this entity, whatever it was, had the power to selectively erase information, it must have been working off something specific. The fact that Exal had retained anything at all suggested that the erasure wasn't all-encompassing. The Zellan, who had been calculating probabilities on his console, finally looked up. If previous records have been erased but partial recollections remain, that means there is a flaw in its method. It does not rewrite all neural pathways. It only removes the knowledge tied to direct memory recall. Exal nodded. Correct, that is why memory storage fails, but instincts remain. Darren sat forward, gripping the edge of his console. So if we can remove our own memories in a way that prevents direct recall, we might be able to hold on to the idea of what happened even if the details are lost. Exal turned toward him. You are beginning to understand. The Vorian clicked his mandibles in thought. But how? How do we selectively erase memories in a way that allows us to remember enough? Exal reached into his console and tapped a command. The holographic display flickered, then shifted to a new set of data, one that had been hidden beneath layers of encryption. The screen displayed a series of equations, neurological patterns, and a single word at the bottom: mnemonic displacement protocol. Darren's pulse quickened as he read through the data. What is this? Exal folded his hands together. A procedure designed for deep memory reallocation. It is a method of transferring conscious recall into the subconscious mind, fragmenting it so that it cannot be directly retrieved, but can still influence behavior and decision-making. The Drayan let out a scoff. So you want us to brainwash ourselves? Exal's expression didn't change. No, I want us to leave breadcrumbs, enough for our future selves to follow even when we no longer remember why.